so much for gracing us with your presence, and thank you to all of you who are in attendance and to all of you who are joining online. I would like to welcome you. For those who are here physically, we do have snacks and some refreshments there, so you can help yourself as we go with the program. Do an introduction of, just a brief introduction of the chair, what it stands for, and can then move to the bio, and then the sort of abstract of the fabulous presentation that Prof has brought to us today. And then in terms of time, Prof, we do have about 1 hour 50 minutes, so you do have time to give us all that you've come with. Then we get the Q&A. So the such chair in critical diversity studies addresses issues around social injustice that occur along axes of difference, and these axes of difference are can be thought of in the lines of race, gender, sex, pregnancy, marital status, ethnic or social origin, color, sexual orientation, age, disability, religion, conscience, belief, culture, language, and birth. And for those who might not know who the actual chair is, it's Prof Marc Epprecht, who is also the director for the Wits Centre for Diversity Studies. The chair addresses these issues, unpacking the ways in which powerful systems of sense-making shape subjectivities that are invested in maintaining forms of organization that are dominated by, centered on, and identified with their interests. These hegemonic systems, for example, whiteness, hegemonic masculinities, able-bodiedness, heteronormativity, among others, intersect and co-construct each other. So we are also very much interested in the question of intersectionality and how that plays out in society. The implication is that unless an approach that addresses the root dynamics of how people operate upon differences grasped and applied, little progress will be made towards creating environments that advance all our talents and are open to receiving all of our contributions. As such, the kind of knowledge produced by the chair is very integral to unlocking the national potential. And currently, we've also been really thinking about the question of the sharing of resources in a world that is stressed, right? So how do we think about the question of distribution, redistribution, and how does that tie with our various positionalities? So, colleagues, I think in brief that is a blurb on the work of the chair. I'm going to introduce Prof Marc Epprecht, who is a professor of global development studies at Queen's University and research fellow with the history workshop here at Wits. He has published extensively on the history of development in Africa, with particular attention to the roles of gender and sexuality. Prof's work Ngochani, the history of a dissident sexuality in Southern Africa. And Prof, this book is one of the key texts that I interacted with in my early days as a student, and I must say it's really impressive work. Another key work is Welcome to Greater Edinburgh, and with Ian Edwards, a work called Working Class Homosexuality in South Africa, Voices from the Archives. Mark has been a lecturer or visiting research fellow at the University of Zimbabwe, the National University of Lesotho, University of Basel, and the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Prof did not come empty-handed, but brings a very exciting and I think relevant presentation, which, if you don't mind, Prof, I can preempt the abstract, because I'm really also very excited by the topic democracy, social / environmental justice and decolonization in Southern Africa today, the colonial archive as ally. Worldwide, a powerful movement calls for decolonization from stubbornly resilient symbols and practices inherited from the colonial episteme. It understands that much more is needed to achieve democracy and social environmental justice than tearing down statues of long-gone oppressors or renaming places for honor indigenous knowledge. The archives in Southern Africa, largely created and curated from colonial times, have emerged as a key target in this project, exemplary of ways of knowing the world that privilege the expert, who is usually straight, white, male, schooled in an alien language, beliefs and conventions, is skewing the colonial archive in favor of new ways to generate archives, and interrogating more diverse and indigenous sources is a tempting option from that perspective. Prof is sympathetic to that argument, but also urges caution. Drawing on nearly 40 years of working in colonial / colonialish archives, Prof likes to argue counterintuitively that these sources can provide critically important evidence to support current struggles, perhaps not to decolonize in the grandest sense, but to temper coloniality in our collective imaginary as we move toward a post-consumer capitalist world. On that note, colleagues, a round of applause for Prof, and Prof, you can have the stage.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd forgotten that I broadened my title compared to what I put on the screen there. Originally, I was going to talk about gender justice, but we can open it up to democracy and social justice more widely, and environmental justice too. They're all connected, actually. And perhaps my co-author in the book that I just mentioned, they're out in the audience. I don't know, are you there? It'd be nice if you are, and you can go in 2 cents worth. Maybe I'll just introduce them. I hope I won't take too much, so we can have a nice discussion about the lecture. So I appreciate it. But I thought I'd just start with some of my working definitions. Decolonization, the word is around a lot, means different things to different people, radically different things. So I think I better start with sharing where I am on this. And of course, in North America, there's Turtle Island, and as indigenous people call it, we're wrestling with the same issues that you are here. On scale, it's different, but it's kind of basically with a lot of common struggles. So my institution is trying to decolonize from inherited structures and conventions. The country itself is trying to decolonize in a political sense because indigenous people, First Nations, about half of them live on what we call reserves still, and they're ruled in a journalistic way. So there's still an ongoing political decolonization. There's institutional decolonization. How can we change the way we govern universities to empower these voices and conventions? And I may have written about this a few times. This air kind of that I see this a lot as an editor of papers coming to you and a peer reviewer, and I see, and this is a really, really good thing. A lot of young, promising African talents is producing new knowledge on this topic of dissident sexuality. That's great. But one thing I see, and I don't see why it has to be this way. There's this compulsion. People feel the need to cite and Judith Butler, and those are all great, and I've done it myself. There's nothing wrong with it necessarily. But I keep nudging people and saying, look, there's African intellectuals who've been wrestling with these ideas from just so long ago. I read a great article just the other day by Mamdani. It was written at British debate about decolonization in the 1960s in Ali Nazri and Rodney. And some of the ideas Ali Nazri was articulating at that time to predate Foucault's ideas about the archives. So, why always to me, it's kind of a colonial, intellectual colonialism. We need to always go to the canon as defined in the West. We have brilliant people here in South Africa, generally. So that would be a kind of convention. And language is another issue. And obviously, I'm speaking to you in English, and so actually a colonial thing. I noticed when I first abstract, I spelled decolonization as dead. It's an American thing, but living in Canada, it becomes invisible sometimes. But I correct this. Because in Canada, we do the American spelling, although we pronounce dead, not Z. So it's kind of, so there's several things that you can debate how and what is it to decolonize that. Symbolically, maybe sometimes it's more than others. Anyways, where am I going? I'm just saying that's bottom for me, the decolonization means to bear in mind that there are many colonizations. It's not just one target, and that not all colonizations are the same. Some may be worth thinking about as positive alternatives to others. That might sound weird. That comes back to the issue of language. So English can easily be a language of questions and prominence from North America or but on the other hand, it can be a liberating thing. I've been working with a colleague from Brazil, so all these workings in Portuguese, so that on this topic, the world is very small indeed in Portuguese. So for him as a scholar, switching to English is incredibly empowering. He's now got access to a huge amount of scholarship that wasn't there. And so I find it really interesting to think about English as having this kind of faces. And obviously it's an old issue here, English versus Afrikaans. It's not anyway, so that's decolonization. We're keeping that in mind, but bearing in mind it's not slogan. You need to know what you're talking about and separate the method from the legal approach. So what I'm going to talk about, so that's my decolonization here, and gender justice or democracy, environmental justice, all those things. But let me focus on gender. Speak up a bit more. Okay, speak up a bit more. Is there I guess there isn't I know I have a soft voice, I'm sorry. I'll try my best. Yes. I'm just going to mention gender of all those things because there is an argument that gender, the concept of gender itself is colonial. I don't know if people have encountered that one. And that there was no gender before the missionaries came and propagated this European ideology of boys do this and girls do that and all that. I'm looking back against that a little bit. I think the basis for that argument, as far as I know, is largely linguistic, and it also ignores a lot of what African scholars have said that from the time, and not just African scholars, but Africans writing at the time in the 19th century, Africans were writing and debating these things too. It's not just the missionaries who were propagating ideas about gender. So I am going to say that this idea of gender justice, it has very deep roots in the region. And I think my last point, and we can have this discussion, the idea of gender as not existing before Europeans came here to promote it. To me, that's colonial kind of thinking, right? It's the same, it's creating another binary. Yes, either or. Maybe a decolonial way of looking at it there's a spectrum, and change happens over time, and there's many issues. But to put all the blame on Europeans for creating the situation, which today, obviously, this is something that's really burning, it has to be voted. So that's my thing on gender justice. Southern Africa, obviously, Southern Africa is a huge area, and mostly my work has been started in Lesotho, Zimbabwe, and now South Africa. So these are Anglophone, mostly Anglophone archives I've been working with. The issues are a bit different. I'm working on a project now in Mozambique with this Brazilian I mentioned. So the colonialism there is different. So that's something to bear in mind. But there's some important continuities that made me take this whole region And I also wanted to open it up because some of you might be doing research in other places and you have your experience to take. Then the Colonial Archive. Okay, so this is something I've been thinking about for the last few years for reasons I'll explain. Just to explain my picture there, I don't know if you recognize that, that building. That's the Zimbabwe National Archives, where I did a lot of the research for home China. And there's a long-standing critique of places like that has been not just the content is largely colonial, since new documents haven't been deposited very scientifically since independence. It's kind of been starved for the new stuff. So the majority of documents are still from the colonial era. The building itself looks kind of oppressive. It's not really kind of decolonial structure. And so there's a critique out there that these archives are part of the problem. That by investing your research in them, you're sort of recreating some of the very oppressive structures and ideas that you're thinking of critiquing. And so I want to engage with that. I'm saying I understand the critique and I'm sensitive to it, but that we as scholars can push back against that in really interesting ways. And one I'll just point out, yes, the building looks like it's kind of in the fascist architecture and such, but there's a utility to that actually. That's keeping this direct sunlight out to protect the paper and such. So yeah, the building looks ugly, but it has a degree of functionality that is helping to preserve this national treasure. Really. So the Zimbabwe National Archives, up until, at least up until independence, and I think for at least a decade after, kept in really, really good condition. I haven't been there in a long time, but they were really good as anything I've seen here. And so it's a kind of national treasure that is being protected by this colonial structure, colonial age structure. So anyways, and then the last thing I want to define is ally, why I chose the word ally. Originally I thought tool, because we're scholars, we use different methods, and we can say it's a tool to help me understand the past. I was thinking about it. I like the word ally better because it suggests, a tool is something that I control 100%, more or less. But an ally is something a little bit unpredictable, right? They've got their own agenda. And I sometimes feel like that when I go to the archives, the Greater Edendale book. I mean, just by chance, I saw some volumes lying on the floor and I looked at them and they hadn't been cataloged. And I opened them and said, whoa, this is going to be great. I have to go through this. That's complete random event. Would never have happened if I physically hadn't been there and seen it with my own eyes. And so there's kind of serendipity, or it's not agency, it's an inanimate object. But there's people there who work there too, and they have their own ideas. The archivists sometimes, and they chat with you and they put you. So ally has a bit more humanity into it than a tool. So that's what I meant there. And they're unpredictable. They may help you, and maybe they decide, no, we're finished with you in this research. Go somewhere else. And that's I get to talk about that. And the last thing I'll say on that, the tool, the other reason I didn't like tool, I know, I'm sure it was Audrey Wood said, you can't dismantle the father's house using the father's tools. And I know what she's saying, but I disagree with her actually. If you ever did any construction, you screw a piece of wood together with a screw, with an electric screw. You want to take that screw out, the easiest thing to do is to flick that switch and you take it out. That's by far the easiest way to dismantle what you have built, rather than get someone else's tool and apply it for it. So that analogy, I know where she's going, but I don't quite agree. Anyways, so tool, ally, whatever. So can it be done? Well, that's the debate. I guess you invited me here, so you must think I sort of did it to a certain extent. It's been a big part of my work since my very first book actually was in Lesotho. And I did a lot of interviews with people, and I learned that interviews are fascinating, but they're also one source that you can't necessarily believe. There are all kinds of problems with with oral interviews. So I combined the two and a few other methods. And then there's homogeneity and another one, heterosexual aspects. It's a little bit different because the first, those two, the Lesotho book and the homogeneity were largely based on unpublished archives. And the homogeneity case, quite a bit of it was from criminal court cases. So never published, they're just sitting there, never cataloged. And the way I got to them was I asked for the whole file for quickly, or scrutinized by the work colonial city. And they would bring me the entire file, sometimes thousands of documents. And then I would go through it systematically to find court cases that were full of information about sexual crimes, especially men. And so that was unpublished stuff. Same with the Lesotho book. It's kind of secret discussions between colonial officials for the most part. And sometimes Lesotho and whatever. The heterosexual Africa is a little bit different in that these are mostly published sources, but it's still an archive. And yeah, I was looking back to trade that there's no what did that? And some of it was expressed orally, but a lot of it was going back to missionary times or even older. The Portuguese started writing about Africa in the 1500s, and they had their criminal court cases as well. There was the Portuguese Inquisition as well to root out heresy. So male sex was what they call it, a nefarious crime. And so the Portuguese have records going back 500 years of these things, including people they had captured in the slave trade were transferred to the Americans. Misbehaving, tried. So those documents are there. So I was going through it. So I myself didn't go find those documents, but others are working on that. But mostly I was looking at published stuff. So what did the missionaries write? What did the travelers write? And through the development of professional scientific discourse on the topic, et cetera, et cetera. But it's still an archive, even though it's published. It's a body of work that you focus your attention on that. That is kind of whole that is supporting your research. Yeah, so I don't know, other people can comment on whether it's successful or not, but I think the idea was to challenge some of the colonial or otherwise oppressive ideas that are in circulation in schools. In the case of, and not just with academic research, the Lesotho book was challenging the idea, the way that history was understood in Lesotho was basically, great men did stuff, right? And women stayed home and cooked, and whatever. Even though a female paramount chief from 1940 until 1960, 20 years, the country was ruled by a female traditional authority who had a lot more power actually than other kind of indirect rule situations. But no one did that. No one had ever done a study of her. It's assumed, well, as a woman, she must be just doing what the men asked her, like tell her to do. She's just a popular for men. So that was kind of the predominant assumption. That wasn't important to know what women were doing on the grounds because they were the chattels of their husbands and the chiefs. And so with the archives, I thought I can see if there's evidence to allow me to challenge that and show that Lesotho women were active agents in shaping the way the colonial rule developed over time. Not just as political figures, like Mansebo was the paramount chieftainess, who, by the way, Nelson Mandela had good things to say about it in his autobiography. He praised her as a leader, African nationalist. I think he was who actually chastised Nelson Mandela at one point because Nelson Mandela, you don't speak the languages of your people. You should learn them. So she said to him, and he said, "You're right, I should." So there's that. So pushing back to the women were political actors, increasingly through the 1940s, 50s, 60s, but also on the ground and in ways that challenged not just the colonial figures, but also traditional authorities, their husbands, many of them were working here, and the women were back in Lesotho, doing stuff that shaped the development of the country, not always for the better, actually. Sometimes it messes things up. But that's part of the complicated story. So by my understanding of decolonization is you're not just going to create another binary of, these people are all good and these people are all bad. You're going to mess that up because that's the way humans are, really complicated compared to some of these colonial simplifications. So that was the Lesotho one, the Hungachani one, the oppressive idea there, and well, both those two. The impressive idea is that there was no such thing as homosexuality, sexuality, or gender variance in Africa before being introduced by Western missionaries and such. And to me, that didn't make sense. But that was very predominantly the political discourse in Zimbabwe when it started, and it was being used to incite violence. So I wanted to challenge that. So I think the archives I found made the case pretty clear that it's not true what the president was saying, that it was, an aspect of colonialism. In fact, the word didn't, obviously the word's new. Just like it was new in Europe, there was no such thing as a homosexual before 1869 or whatever. The word was coined at the time, but that doesn't mean practices and behaviors and whatever were there before. So I think I tried to show that. So to me, it's in the spirit of decolonization from politically, socially oppressive ideas. So that's what I was trying to do. And the same with this Edendale thing. So I did write this book, and again, it's primarily based on archival sources, unpublished, and these are at the level of city government. So I don't know if anyone's ever been to Edendale. It's like to Pietermaritzburg what Soweto is to Johannesburg. It's the kind of township, but it's not a township. It was a freehold, Africans owned property there, sort of like Alex, except the whole way through apartheid, Africans still held title to the land. And it was also a multiracial community well into the 1970s. And so I wanted to challenge again this kind of simplifying discourse in this country, if I may say that. The apartheid era as monolithic, but there were struggles under apartheid, and including in this place between, I think we would say liberals, but black liberals as well as white liberals versus the National Party ideology. And so that, to me, that was really, really interesting to get out there and show some of that history. But the critique I got, and this is in thinking about it a lot, and I was aware of this as I was going through the archive. Obviously, it's in English. It's not giving what the Zulu-speaking people of the town, village, and the Tamil-speaking people, and the Afrikaans-speaking people, they live together in this place. It's not giving their perspectives directly. It's filtered through the perspective of the white officials for the most part, with a few important exceptions. So I knew that, but I still felt it's better to get this out there as a starting point, and then we'll get people interested in following up. So that was the whole idea of creating this Edendale history project. Something like that does, and they've done in Orlando, and they've done in Alex, and you go into the community and then you train people, the ethics or the methods of oral research to get young people to interview old people. How did he live back in the day, and this and that. And so we were working on that. So that oral history project needs to be a supplement. But the documentary work was the first step. And then you learn from the documents kind of questions to put to people. They'll have their own things to say, but you just ask old people, tell me about the past. Whatever, they can go on and on and on about the 1951, or whatever, it could be anywhere. You need to give a little bit of guidance to people to think about stuff. So how do you know what questions prompt people for? And that was coming from the archives, the documentary sources. Unfortunately, COVID came in, and this project has kind of got stopped. So that's not. And hopefully, if Ian is here, my co-author there, Ian Edwards, these are two other publications. Work Platform Sexuality and South African History is primarily documents. In the one case from 1907, there was a commission of inquiry into mine marriage, as it was called, on the mines here, where men from African men from all over, but many from Mozambique and such, they came to the mines, the families were way back in the rural areas, and they formed male-male relationships. So there was an investigation. And a lot of people have written about that, Dunbar Moody and Patrick Harris and whatever. They've taken the documents, they read it, and then they've interpreted it for us as good historians. And so we can read the historians' books. So what he and I are saying here is, don't trust us, read it yourself. Right? The one document is the interviews that were done in 1907, and I think there was about 50 of them, or something like that. So the white officials interviewing African men and boys. So you can hear for yourself what those African men and boys were saying 100 plus years ago. And it's really interesting. And Ian cited it. He did oral interviews back in 1995, 6, something like that. And collected interviews from older, well, male-bodied people, but probably nowadays they would identify as trans. They lived as feminine people back in the 1950s in Durban, working class kind of suburb, informal community for the most part, back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and then they were moved out with the apartheid. They came back in the late 1990s, and Ian interviewed them, and nothing became of that. So he had this archive of interviews sitting in a drawer somewhere, and then he reached out to me like a few years back and said, "What should I do with this? Well, let's put it together. Don't you write about it. Let the people read for themselves." So when you pick it up, pick up that book, I'm sure you're going to do in any moment. You will read a little bit what Ian is saying. He's introducing it, and likewise I am. So they go straight to the horse's mouth. You're going to hear what these men said in the 1990s, thinking back to the 1950s. So that's a direct connection to another generation. And I say in my own experience, why I became an historian, and I didn't know what to do when I was whatever, at 20 something. But I took a great course at the master's level, I'm sure. And the prof said to me at one point, "Look, there's these documents." It was from the Belgian Congo, actually. I didn't know anything about the Belgian Congo. He said, "Go, we have these documents." It was at York University in Canada on microfilm. The torturous way to look at documents, but it's anyways. I went to it, and it was so interesting. I could hear the voices of people from the Belgian Congo. And it was a criminal case. And you could hear the voice of the state versus the voice of an accused official, sort of a Kurtz kind of character from the Heart of Darkness. And this white official was defending himself, and Africans were brought in as witnesses, and the state was arguing. To me, it was incredible. It was the most empowering to me to be able to see for myself, not rely on some historian whom I don't trust, as a historian have got their own agenda, right? And so you can make up your own mind. So it's kind of empowering. That's the idea of this book, was to do that. So the young African scholars here in South Africa, they don't know what to do. They're thinking maybe I should do engineering. No, read this book. You're going to get so excited and want to become a historian. That's well, at least in high school, get people interested in history, because it seems to me, but maybe you know better. There's this prejudice, this idea that history is something that, it's a colonial activity anyways. That why do we need to harp on about the past? We've got other things to do. And so it's like people from away, like people from Canada pushing this stuff. When, in my experience, anyways, a lot of Africans don't want to remember. They're just kind of strategic forgetting almost. Things are a bit painful. So better just leave it alone. And here I'm coming and bringing up this stuff, and let's talk about it. So, but where Ian and I are saying here, no, this is really exciting to be able to do it yourself and not rely on outsiders. So that's a decolonial act, if you ask me. And then the last one, the section archives is published online with Gala here. It's another great archive. The only one in Africa, the whole continent, which is explicitly focused on same-sex issues. It's a very, very rich source of information. You can name anyone who has a public figure as gay or whatever. There is documents that there's Cecil Williams. You can go back farther and farther. Simon Cody, etc. Those people, you can see their own communications and hear their voices. Again, not relying on interpreters. So that's all there. Now, what I wanted to do with this one, like I said, in Zimbabwe, I've gone through all these court cases, thousands and thousands and thousands, from which I extracted about 400 or so evidence from these cases, going back to 1891 or so. And I had in effect made a catalog that was sitting in my desk. When Ian called me up for that, the working class book, I thought, well, look, I've got this catalog. Why don't I publish it so that people in Zimbabwe can go find those court cases? Because I couldn't use them all for the book. I used maybe 10%. And there's 90% of that evidence has never been properly reflected upon. I mean, I reflected upon it. I made a decision. Those 90% are not adding new information. I took the best for the purposes of constructing an argument. That was my judgment. But maybe Pujai could go there and say, no, you forgot this case. Here's someone from northern Rhodesia or Zambia. Why didn't you talk about him? Because there's some interesting things there. And yeah, so someone else could look at the very same documents that I did and make a different decision about what's important. And so, and they could do it in a different way too. All of these cases, the court decided it's important to write down the ethnic groups. So you could do a whole study of the construction of ethnic identity as related to sexuality. That's another project which I could do myself, that someone could do. Anyways, the catalog is there now. It's online. And it's got the numbers. So you could go to the building there in Harare and you tell the archivist this number, D5, etc., 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 and they will bring you the document and you'll see it. Aha, Epprecht was wrong, or whatever you find. And some of the basics of the court cases are there as well. So it's like annotated. It's got some of the testimony and stuff. And some of it's interesting. I mean, okay, I'm going to end it. I'm going on way too long here, but to me, it's a fascination. And this is from the book with Ian. In my section, the Zimbachani Yase Modi, the mine lives of Johannesburg, and this was this investigation conducted in 1907. So a few hundred pages of evidence that was gathered, but from missionaries, from the mine officials, and from African men and boys themselves. And some of it goes against what scholars have said. It complicates the story. There's also photos, so not in this particular document, but you can find photos that also speak. That's another kind of archive that, a picture tells 1,000 words. That's from one of the mines on the left, where the commission of inquiry took place. They went on this mine all along here. They went from one to the other. One day they're at Crown Mine, the next day they're at et cetera, to interview people. And this, I don't know, I can't remember if that's Crown Mine there, but this picture comes from. Oh, you can't see it. Oh, there it is. Yeah. Yeah, that's from about 1907, the Crown Mine, where the inquiry was taking place. And the picture tells 1,000 words or poses 1,000 questions, like, why are those men dressed like that? What does it mean? Obviously, there's all kinds of stories that could be teased out from there, which that's not for me to do right now. That's another project. You can go through photographic archives and ask questions. Why are they wearing those particular things? What is the meaning of that hat versus that headdress or that not carrying, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one thing. There's a few pictures in the book, but the testimony is what we focused on. So I just extracted this one as an example. So James Lumiana, I think he came from Melsetter, Chimani, in Zimbabwe. So he was a migrant laborer, and he was testifying, and in italics, that's the question put to him by the white official. Do you know this practice in Botswana? So you can see, here's James explaining what it is in his own words. And yeah, there's all kinds of stories you can get out of there. The second one, I did not know it was a crime. Was because the compound manager didn't care about it. That's the white official in charge. So if he didn't care, why should I, sort of thing. Anyways, so that's James himself speaking directly to us. So what's the use of that? How's that decolonial? Well, in a number of ways. So the word homochani in the Shona language these days, I've heard people say, that's not a real Shona word. White people invented it in order to discredit Africans, as if that makes sense. But here's the word more than 100 years ago. And it's coming from probably the Shona language. So it doesn't, it's kind of a document that trips up that narrative that white people invented this word, the word, the practice, except the identity. So the archive, I guess, I'm used if there's a specific oppressive political discourse in the moment, people are making claims, and you find a document that refutes that claim, that can be helpful to the objectives. And then a final thing, and I'll wrap up here, is this was a young boy, I think 14 years old, something like that. And he was testifying. And you can imagine the scenario. Here we got two older, powerful white men sitting behind a desk like this, and they're calling people. And here's a 14-year-old boy from wherever, and he has to give testimony about a topic that's not easy to talk about even today. And these white men are asking, what do you know about having sex with other boys and men? But here he gives his testimony. Seems pretty obvious what he's saying. And this is useful too, because one of the arguments that scholars have made is that if they accept, homosexuality existed, but only because the structures of racial capitalism made African men do this. If it hadn't been for the minds, there wouldn't be same-sex relations. And the critique of that argument is, again, it's putting all the blame on the white folks. It's saying African men are just helpless victims of the system. And here, when you listen to this young man, he says, no, I loved that man. So that complicates the narrative a little bit, right? It's putting a bit of humanity and showing men as people, not just victims of this system. And when you push it farther, you find that they have actually manipulated the system. This is not something that the white managers actually wanted. And certainly the missionaries didn't want it. But they felt constrained. They couldn't do it. If love is involved, it becomes a lot more difficult to ban than if it's simply something that could be reorganized. And this was one of the ideas. Why don't we just organize female sex workers for the men? That was a serious option at the time, that the mines and the state would support that, bring in African women and sex workers so the men wouldn't have to do that. But they rejected that idea for different reasons, and then basically turned a blind eye because trying to suppress this, you can't suppress love, I guess what I'm saying. Anyways, I don't know if that's Jazzy and Tail, but they look like a happy couple from 1907 ground mine. So I'll end on that point, and hopefully if people have stories of their work in the archives or whatever, please, I'd love to hear it.
Thank you so much, Bob, for that. I'm sure colleagues will agree that also very detailed and well researched presentation. before I open it up, I just wanted to sort of reflect on some of the issues that Prof has covered. And I think one of the ones that I find very empowering and important is the voice of the archive. And I like how you frame this as the archive as an ally. Yeah, the voice of the archive, I think, is very important in giving access to certain information, practices, and experiences that we cannot otherwise cross over to 1907 and get access to. So I think that's very important. And I mean, I'm very excited by this project because I think we already had a conversation. I was telling that I'm very much interested in working with archives. But I've also been thinking about this question, and you've brought it up, and it's a conversation we always have around the question of gender and the point around how it's something that has existed in pre-colonial society, and I'd very much love to hear what the floor also think about from their various contexts. But also the question of the colonial building, sort of the irony of a colonial building housing potential for decolonial projects. I also find that very interesting, and the question of the using the master's tool to dismantle the master's house. I really like how you sort of really brought that to life, and I think it's a conversation that most of the decolonial thinkers in our space also talk about when we talk about sort of the danger of seeing decolonial work and as nativism, so sort of throwing away everything and not sort of embracing the potential that these devices have for us. And the last point, as I also invite colleagues to reflect or to ask questions, is also about how we can imagine a decolonial project that makes more use of the archive, and also, I mean, the various definitions of decolonization that we have across various movements. For example, in South Africa, we think about Feesmasville movement, and how does that sort of kind of speak to some of these ongoing discourses and forms of activism. And I'm also, Jamie has also pointed out there that colleagues who have joined online, please feel free to raise your hand or type in the chat so that we can also hear from you. We have at least about a round of 3-4 questions, and then we can have the conversation going. You can see that William, Tulani, colleagues, sorry, Jane, blending there. Yes, you go ahead, your name? Oh, you can go ahead.
A few things that got me interested that actually just got me thinking about the idea of active forgetting. Sorry. Sorry. The idea of active forgetting, like, you know, making that from that effort, especially in place like something that you mentioned. And I'm wondering, also thinking about that as someone who's in history in a country whereby we sort of being told to move away from that, and how being in history, especially if you're a Black young person, becomes more of a luxury or something which seems unattainable. And how do we perhaps think about that? I also wanted to ask a question about what is also the role of us as historians, if not as interpreters. If we're not interpreters in a way that, like, where the world that sort of sees the victors as the ones who are the writers of history, And again, going back to my first question, that like so now it always seems as if it's something that is undertaken to be in the space of history. How do we think about that? I don't know if that makes sense, but I also wanted to ask the last question about with the idea of victimhood, and I'd like for you to be that maybe help me understand. Outside of thinking of things like sorry, and that's a very new word for me, which is really interesting, even though like I've tried my best to give some of the truth. But I'm interested in like not just thinking about it as victimhood, trying to move away and move along with what you're saying, but thinking about in a system where Black men have are still fighting that idea of being not just men, moving away from the culture of being men as elders to now being boys. As you come into the city, you work as a domestic worker prior to like that woman entering this, entering, the urban space, and then moving in some of them, then move from such spaces into the mind. So that constant negotiation of like your manhood and being a boy in the system, how do we not think about it in terms of victimhood, but find other alternatives too, so think up through it as not just a sex thing, but also a structural thing. I don't know. Yeah.
Can we take one more, because I realize there are 3 questions there. Cheyenne, and then Prof can respond.
Yes, thank you so much, Prof, for this very interesting session. I just have a question with respect to the last image, the slide that you showed about the narrative of 14-year-old boy. And you also shared that this narrative is in a way complex, and you say that there is some sort of humanity in it. I'm a bit skeptical about associating the term humanity in that context, because though it's written about where the boy says about gifts and presents, but I mean, at the end of the day, isn't it a sort of sexual violence that the boys were undergoing in that circumstance? Obviously, to be very honest and to be also on the side of acknowledging the fact that I was totally unaware of this issue. So my understanding comes from a totally non-contextual way, but just reading the particular slide and isn't it in a way of at the end of the day it's a sexual exploitation, and can't those gifts and presents be a way of silencing them and telling that how badly they're sexually exploited? So that was my question for you. Thank you.
Okay, maybe I'll start with that one because it's kind of the easiest one. Yes, I don't know in the case of Dale and Jazi here. I think Jazi was also quite young. He wasn't a grown man. But in the catalog from Zimbabwe, there are many cases like that we would call child abuse, definitely. So my point is, yeah, I'm not trying to romanticize this, but people, when I say humanity, I mean the full range. Bad, evil, abusers are a part of humanity. And so we need to talk about that. And when I started, I was working with lesbians in Zimbabwe, trying to support their activism. And I told them, look, I'm going to these archives and I'm not going to come with some picture of, 1990s loving same-sex mutual relationships. I don't think I'm going to find that. But there was more than just sexual violence. So that's what I meant by that. But those stories of exploitation were there. Now, then, the key other thing for that is how different was that from relationships between men as men in a traditional setting and women? And what you find in these cases is they're very, very conservative. Other than the body, the physical body, the relations between the man as the one who gives gifts and the woman as the one who provides the man with sexual release was almost the same as what you would find in rural areas. So that's really interesting. The book I mentioned by Dunbar Moody, Going for Gold, he talks about this, and I read it. I summarized his argument in Hongchani, that this mine system, he argues, kind of disappeared in the 1970s, partly as a result of a lot of Zimbabwean, more politically conscious people came into the mines in the 70s, and they noticed, okay, these South African men are behaving in this really tribalistic way, not the homosexual, but in a very conservative gender frame. And so the more politically conscious Zimbabwean workers kind of expose that to public humiliation. So there's all these kind of interesting dynamics. I mean, go on and on about, but you're quite right. The point is not to romanticize and portray a counter ideal of, but to show the full complexity of what people like living in situations that are extremely difficult. So the question that Kifue was asking about changing masculinities is a really important part of these archives too. You know, how did these men and actual boys in many cases, it wasn't until the 1920s, I think, that they banned young boys from traveling. So these men would come from Zimbabwe or whatever, traveling with their servants, they call them servants. They could be 10 years old, whatever. It wasn't until the 1920s that changed. So young men, young boys, some of the boss boys were the language of the time, right? They were educated, some of them were Christian. And so you can see the debates among African men themselves, of different status, level of education. How do we cope with the situation? It's complicated, it's oppressive, but on the other hand, we've now got cash, which we used to rely on our fathers for cattle. Now we can get around. So there were advantages as well as oppressive aspects of the system. And so the interesting thing is the archive, when you look at it in full, shows the complexity and the debates changing over time in relation to different factors. And that to me is what's so interesting. And to get to your other question, well, anyways, I'm a historian, so I'm biased about this. But I think if we don't have historians, someone else is going to write it for you, right? If you say, I don't remember the past, well, some unscrupulous politician or other leader is going to say, if you don't remember it, I remember it. And it's this way, and it benefits me to have that narrative out there. And you see that everywhere. Every authoritarian regime in the world tries to suppress historians. And you see that happening in the United States right now. Banning books, banning, even talking in schools about the history of slavery. Why? They're afraid of history. And that's why I think, maybe that comes to my democracy in the title. A vibrant democracy needs independent historians to challenge the lies and propaganda that are coming from unscrupulous politicians, corporations, etc. So having an independent voice enriches civil society that can trip up these authoritarian narratives that are there. So when the government of South Africa or your peers saying, why are you doing this useless work? You can come back and say, no, it's not useless, especially in this time of ChatGPT. So, you know, people are going to be lazy, right? Basically. And they're going to ask GPT, write me up something, right? But if there's no ability, people aren't trained to look through and assess, where is this real? Then the society as a whole is impoverished. So that's why I think we need historians more than ever to challenge not just the lies of politicians, but the fantasies of completely amoral technology. That it's going to be more and more and more a part of our civic discourse. Machines are talking to who's going to challenge that and say, no, this isn't correct. This is coming from where we know is not true. I don't know, is that fully answer your question? That's a history workshop.
Thank you so much, Prof. And thank you for these questions. As you jot down other questions, one in the chat from Tokozo. And Tokozo says, thank you, Prof, for your interesting presentation. The archive only Konchani mentions gifts and money, so even though love might be involved, there is clear transactional sex taking place and perhaps even outright sex work. How does Prof read or make sense of this? Is there some relationship between transactional sex or sex work and queerness? Thank you. Thank you, Tokozo, for that question.
Yeah, maybe I answered that already, that the transactional sex in that sense existed in a traditional setting. The husband is morally obliged to give something to his wife or wives. So this transaction is not necessarily different from a heterosexual relationship. So the queerness, I mean, no, these people would never have used that term. That's a very recent term. Queerness, they never would have seen themselves as homosexual or anything. They would see themselves as men in a certain situation. When they went home at the end of the contract, whatever, they would have their wives and girlfriends, and the same transactions would happen, more or less. So I don't know if that satisfies you. Goes on.
Any questions? Any other questions? You go ahead.
Prof, I wanted to ask if there's some literature on sexual socialization in Southern Africa pre-colonization. Now I'm wondering if practices like so, like if it's in sex, because I think that's the one that you mentioned, presentation. How does it have any links? Are there any links to that in terms of what the men they do?
Yes, that's so, you know, we don't know for sure. It's very sketchy what people describe the actual sex acts, but what's there in other sources is that this was modeled on heterosexual adolescent sex play, where adolescents would learn how to have a good sexual relations without fear of pregnancy. And so this was modeled on that. And there's a theory that the word Mkachani actually comes from the Tonga language, more or less the same thing. Kabanga in Xhosa and etc. And that adolescent heterosexual sex play was not stigmatized. It was regarded as much, much preferable than sex where the girl might get pregnant. That would be a terrible thing. So much better that you play like this, play. And these men and boys often use that word to play. It's just play, it's not sex, right? They would, when asked, you know, it's like Bill Clinton, one time they asked, did you have sex? He said no. Because he had in his mind what sex means, a very narrow definition. So the same here, that's not sex, it's play. Just like teenage boys and girls.
I can see people that are thinking about questions, but Prof, I also have a question around, I mean, in the same manner that we were saying the term homosexual was not sort of present or actively used during these times. And then I think this is also one of the things that excites me to interact with your projects. Then would the same be said about the term homophobia? Sort of like what was your sort of understanding of the fear of these acts, or the obsession that the powers that be had with regulating or stopping what could be what we now term homosexual practice or male sex? So yeah, I think I just wanted to find out from you whether whether one can point to that as some form of homophobia, or it was control of sexuality that was equally exerted even on heterosexual relationships. So where was the concern over these relationships being public coming from? And then the last one there is also, I wanted to reflect on this, but I see it was at the bottom of my notes. When you spoke about how decolonization blurs binaries. And I was just thinking, I mean, to probe you further on that thought, to say, for me, the challenge with thinking with you there is what do we do with the binaries? And I guess that could be sound like a very philosophical question, but within the binary of, for example, black and white, gay and straight, what kind of, how does that decolonial project that those binaries look like? And here we talk about, I mean, our work with CDL, we talk about praxis, how we can turn such an idea, for example, into a practical sort of community of practice. So I just wanted to find out what your ideas would be around how we can escape these particular binaries. Are there any other? Yes, I saw you in there. I saw you in there. You can go ahead.
Thank you very much. I was just curious about your backstory, actually. And I might have missed it. Sorry, I was a few minutes late. What initially drew you to come to research in Southern Africa? Just to know how Canadian, if I understood correctly, landed up this area. And then also from a methodology perspective, I'm just curious about archival research. Being someone that's outside of research, do you think, is there some reflexivity that's required when dealing with archival research versus, for example, participative, where it's very, where there's a lot of reflexivity that's required if you're an outsider within doing research? Yeah, just two kind of practical questions.
Yeah, just on so I'll start with the homophobia thing. Obviously, the word homophobia is even newer than the word homosexual. In this particular case, at the mines, the mine owners knew about this from long before. They didn't care. Actually, it was a good thing from their point of view, because if the men and boys are having sexual relations in-house with each other, they're not going out to have sex with women. And remember, at this time, they're trying to keep women out of the cities. So now the men from the compounds just to go out and have transactional sex, it's going to create a market. Women are going to come. It increases the problems faced by the state at that time. So the mine owners were happy about this. It keeps women away to a certain extent, and it keeps the men healthy because they're not having penetrative sex, right? It's between the thighs, there's no viruses involved, and it keeps the men calm. They can have that sexual release, and it's kind of it's politically calming. So the mine owners knew about this from at least. Well, the first reference I saw was 1819, something like that. The mines opened in 1886. They knew about it almost from the beginning, and they didn't care. What made them care, I can tell the whole story if you're interested. Even after the war, the Anglo-Boer War, or the Great South African War, or whatever you want to call it, the mines shut down, and the African workers went back to the rural areas. So the British, after 1902, they're worried, how do we start the mines up again as fast as possible? Because we have this war to get the gold, we need to get it back going. And Africans weren't coming back. The wages were too low and the conditions were bad, so Africans were not coming. So they brought in Chinese, indentured labor from China. big numbers. And so what's that got to do with anything? For the white workers, you know, in the racial stereotypes of the day, Africans were at the bottom. Chinese were considered to be semi-civilized, and Chinese could replace white workers. So the white workers organized themselves against the Chinese. And one of the ways they did it was to tap into this moralistic argument that the Chinese are immoral people, they gamble, and the Chinese are corrupting Africans. Okay, they're bringing these Oriental behaviors, and Africans are, you know, childlike race. We white people have to protect Africans from these external influences. And this got debated as far as Westminster in London. It was a big public scandal. And so it comes from the white workers trying to get the Chinese out. And they succeeded, actually. Once that scandal had passed, one of the missionaries here said, okay, you're talking about the Chinese. What about Africans doing it to Africans? Shouldn't we talk about that too? So it came from the missionaries. So there was like public shaming. And so the mine owners and state officials had to keep a lid on that as much as possible. Again, because the hegemonic kind of justification for colonialism and later apartheid is that us white folks are going to protect Africans. Now you're saying we're creating conditions whereby they're doing these behaviors. It has to be shut, covered up as fast as possible. So one argument I think is me, I found it plausible, is that the commission of inquiry was a way to kind of shut the missionaries up and say, okay, we're going to deal with this and contain the problem. But the actual sex act between men and boys, from the point of view of mine owners and managers, they couldn't care less, except it's a good thing, ironically. So that's on that, that answers the question. Then how to escape binaries in practical terms? Well, that's a big question, and I don't know. I'm a historian. We're having these debates at Queens all the time, like Washington's. So you've got boys and girls Washington. What are you going to do about that? So it's contested terrain right now, and it depends on the kind of resources you can muster. I think as long as the guiding principle is respect for the dignity and integrity of people, then we'll find a way through it. But it's tough. It will be different in every case. But I don't see why it's important to cling to these binaries when evidence doesn't support. Why should we do that? Especially because at the time, those binaries didn't exist to the way that they do now. So we're importing those binaries from the present to the past. Why do that? Why do we feel committed to that when it wasn't widely believed at that time? So I know it makes it more complicated. You have to have more footnotes and you have to explain things more. But what's wrong with that? Anyways. And then how to read against the grain. So that is a big question. There's a whole bunch of scholarship. I just saw a new book out there that's this very topic. There's a whole discipline of how to read these documents against the ideology of the people who wrote it. You're trying to read between the lines or against the grain, as they say. So yes, you need a lot of reflexivity, and you'll see there's a word. That person used that word at that time. You have to know why. What did that word use mean at that time? And I'll give one example from that time. The K word and the N word were not as offensive as they are now. So African men and boys used it all the time. So it acquired a more derogatory meaning over time. So that's important to think about how that word changed its meaning over time and such. So that's it's kind of, I don't know, it's not a science, it's an art. And it's I'll just say one thing on that, and in terms of the art of this, and that's another beauty of these archives as a physical relic versus digitalized. So digital archives are a fantastic, amazing breakthrough. It's opening up this kind of work to a much broader audience. But sometimes the physical archives can reveal secrets in a way that doesn't get digitized. And I've encountered it myself. Is, the official document will be typewritten from that time, or maybe handwritten in nice ink, and then circulated among the officials who comment on it, sometimes in very faint pencil. Right, so they don't want to express their view on record, but they'll write, bullshit. And that won't show up on the digitized version necessarily, it might, but you'll see it there in the physical room. Say, okay, that's what that official really thought, but publicly they were saying something else. So how do you negotiate that? Yeah, it's really one of the most fun things about reading historians is going through all that kind of stuff and seeing the. Yeah, anyways, I'll finish that. On my personal story, well, I don't want to go on about that too much, but what can I say? I came to Zimbabwe after independence when they're opening up the school system. I guess I knew about French phenomenon, I knew about all that stuff from before. Like I said, we had these struggles in Canada as well. On a wildly different scale in terms of the colonized people, they're a tiny fraction of the population. Settler population is 95% of Canada, it's settlers, right? But we're still wrestling with the same thing. In my particular community where I grew up, it was a First Nation indigenous people 20 kilometers away. So we had it there. I had a bit of concern as a young man, what can I do to help the global revolution, right? That's where I was at that time. And I came over soon after as a teacher, and the whole talk at that time was decolonization, obviously, but with a kind of quite humane face to it. They had reconciliation, they talked about scientific socialism, redistribution. It was very progressive at that time. So, it's changed, but it was made a big impression on me as a young man. So I wanted to come back and build my career by doing that.
There's a question here. I'm going to read. It's Stembiso says, thank you, Prof, for this lovely lecture. It was very nice to hear you speak to the great work you've done. This might be slightly off topic, but it speaks to some of the arguments you have made. I have published a paper which unpacks pervasive heteronormativity in sub-Saharan Africa using queer theory to provide opportunities that demonstrate the importance of applying deconstructive and non-binary approaches towards sexuality and space in sub-Saharan Africa. As something that you have noted in your work, queer theory has been argued to be linked to the Euro-American views because of its roots that display perceptions of the West / global North, which are somewhat ignorant to the experiences of queer people in the global South. I know that you've also argued that queer theory is an effective approach to sexuality research globally, and I'm wondering what your current thoughts are on the theory. And a disclaimer, I hope I could hear you as we were experiencing a bit of some sound issues. So that's the question from, what's her name? Stembiso.
All right, Stembiso, thank you very much for that question. I look forward to reading your article. Yeah, people can label themselves however they want. I don't want to say you can't do queer theory. If it works for you, do it. My problem, which I still have, that hasn't been resolved, I hear queer theory is getting used more. I don't see it. So I have theory. My personal the word queer way and Lesotho and I don't activists have a lot of purchasing right. So it's not coming organically from that's, but if it works for you as a person, I like the work of, for example, Adrian van Klinken, and there's another new book, well, new-ish, and getting out of this, it's going to come to me, who have that same kind of attitude. Yes, there's a lot of skills and tools in queer theory that we need to think about. But I'm not going to promote it for other people. If something else works that does the same thing, then call it whatever you want. And I have the kind of same, we're talking about environmental justice, I have the same thinking there too. You know, all kinds of terms that are out there now being circulated. Degrowth is one. Moving away from this paradigm of perpetual economic growth. It's not possible. It's fantasy. But that word doesn't have political purchase here in South Africa very much at the moment. Anyways, people like eco-socialism or solidarity economy means the same thing as far as I'm concerned. So use what is politically appropriate in the context where you're working, see what works for you. I'm happy with that. But don't come to me like a missionary to tell me if I don't use queer theory explicitly that somehow my work isn't good enough. I would take exception to that.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, we are both monopolizing the space. I also wanted to find out in my interaction with the WiCDS publication. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the question in the Zimbabwean context, what I came across, and I see you haven't also covered it here, the question of female sexuality with regards to same-sex in the Zimbabwean context. I see, I mean, the male sexuality features, particularly within sort of the labor system. So I'm also curious to find out whether you found some archives on sort of the nature of female sexuality in the Zimbabwean archive. You look like you want to ask a question. I'll come to you after. Yes. You go ahead.
Oh, I can. Thank you. Probably just probably only read secondary literature, but I was wondering if you could tell us if the archives if there's any sort of indication of how black women in the minds and feeling, for instance, with the arrival of black women into the cities, because most of the time it's like the same scene, these women is in nuisance, so forth. So I just wanted to basically black women reacting to this point.
Okay, Kieran, sure.
I'm interested in the concept of the archive, and I'm interested to hear, did you go anywhere beyond the colonial archive for the research? Did you conduct interviews? How would you have gone about that? Was there any information that you weren't able to access that you think would have been useful for your research? And then what would a contemporary archive look like going beyond the colonial archive? What kind of information would it contain? What medium would it be contained in? What is like a good example of an interwoven kind of archive or holistic kind of archive? Does that even exist? Is it possible that it could exist? Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, great questions. And the answer to yours first is yes, totally. So the nature of the archive depends. What helps you as a researcher depends on your questions are. So if you're doing research on the post-19, it's about 1990s gals, so then you've got a public face. So your archive changes. So now there's publications that are accessible. And in the case of gals, they have their own little newsletters and things. And then you can interview people, they're still alive, and they can tell their personal stories. And all of that. Yeah, so you can come up with as many sources as possible. One I found by accident, and this was a really interesting one. I finished on the time. I was down working on the Edale stuff in Marisburg, and I came across this obscure reference to graffiti in the prisons. So people, wrote on the walls because they're in there for 2 years, and some of the graffiti was referring to these relationships in prison. Not famous on the lines. It's important to distinguish, but still, there were these mind relationships. So the interesting thing there was, this reference, I followed it up. There was a European researcher who had an African research assistant who was trying to destroy that archive. So the research assistant did not want the European to see this, so it was actively trying to destroy it, and the European tried to just found that out and then preserved it. So the interesting kind of destruction, because the African male was embarrassed and didn't want that history to get out there. But there's another source, wow, graffiti in the washrooms, man, if you can find it. Some of these sources are extremely ephemeral, by the way. How do you preserve stuff like that? Actually, gets painted over in a few years, that sort of thing. But some of the stuff survives in strange places. So there's, I think, the possibility of a wide range of sources, including oral history, including new media, coming out of some of the stuff coming out of Nigeria, or really context you think of as very, very oppressive. There's an extremely vibrant surge of new media where this is being talked about in amazing ways, and I'm grateful that I don't have to do that. So, but you can find this, and Snapchats. Can you do a history of Snapchats? Might be possible, but you need different skills from what I'm talking about. Anyways, but yes, absolutely. For China, I interviewed people, and coming to the other question about women in cities and such. Yeah, the colonial officials were not interested in women particularly, as long as they didn't cause problems. They didn't care about if female sex happened. There's no problem. There's no pregnancy involved. There's nothing. Who cares? It's just women, right? From the point of view of the officials. So not one single case ever came into the colonial that was worth writing down in Zimbabwe. And I've never seen anything from South Africa, which it wasn't, and this was an interesting post-colonial little footnote here. There were activists who were challenging the colonial law in Botswana. This was a few years ago. They said, look, your law against homosexuality, it's discriminatory. It's only focused on men who have sex with men. And the activists were hoping to the courts to shame the government of Botswana for still keeping this discriminatory colonial law after whatever 50 years. Now the government of Botswana said, you're right, it is discriminatory. We're going to make it illegal for women to have sex too. So they decolonized by making the law worse. But that now be challenged, actually. So finally that's thrown out. But yeah, finding women, you can't rely on documents, and you have to go elsewhere. And there are a few interesting cases. So I did some research like that. It's difficult. It doesn't come out in stories about, sexual abuse or sexual exploitation or these kind of relationships. It comes out mostly in stories about traditional spirit possession or embodiment by a male ancestor. So that's, I'm not answering your question on this. I think in fact, there is a case of oral history that was collected by Zimbabweans from older Zimbabwe, in which female sexuality comes out. There's oral history archives in Zimbabwe National Archives, where they talk about certain powerful female spirit beings. Why are they powerful? Because they have a male ancestor coming into their bodies. So the male ancestor cannot have sex with a man in the physical world, right? The male ancestor needs to have a female wife. So the male ancestor has got a female wife for that. And that male ancestor might go up. So those kind of stories come through. It's not homosexuality, but it's two female bodied people having sometimes a long-term intimate relationship. And one of the curious things about this, and this was collected in the 1970s. So it's an African man struggling to put a name on this. How can I explain this? And he used the word lesbian. which is completely anachronistic. And he was talking about a woman in 17 something. Of course, it wasn't a lesbian relationship, but in 70s, it's like, yeah, but in terms of the women coming into town, because they did in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, the number of women coming to town. So that's another history that people have written about. It did change the dynamic very much. But as you know, there was a lot of tension between the people who lived in hostels and the people who lived in the townships. That broke into actually war in some cases. So it's I believe, but it hasn't been properly researched, that that issue of sexuality was part of the tension between township life and this kind of gender conservative life in the townships. So yeah, now of course it's all changed again, right? So the hospitals are largely gone, and people have normalized in some cases to accommodate heterosexual families. But it is an argument that the growing presence of women in town changed that whole dynamic for a bit. Not necessarily the index skill. I mean, and there's been some very interesting oral history that has found that, and I've seen this on video, where a female wife from Lesotho was saying she knows, my husband goes to the mines and he's got a boyfriend there. It's okay, I don't mind. It's better he's got a boyfriend than he's got a girlfriend. Because if he's got a girlfriend, it's going to be a family, and his resources are going to go to her and her family, not to me in Lesotho. So there's a kind of wink, wink, you don't mind, because it's helping to preserve the homestead back in the areas. Ironies. Then you only get to that through the kind of oral research. None of that would show up in the colonial document, because many times the colonial officials really didn't care. They needed the labor, the men, and the men could go home when they were sick or broken. That's fine. But when the men were there, they needed to be healthy, and anything that helped them, it's fine. The moral agenda was coming from some politicians, but mostly from the missionaries. And so the game was to outwit the missionaries and fool them that everything is fine.
And your name?
Yeah. You answered my question. I was thinking about whether the mind is actually operates as a space of a sense of thinking for these particular men perhaps wanting to explore their sexuality. But then I was wondering about when they go back home, how they receive to particularly receive how they're dressed. When they go back home, are they very masculine, stern, husband, and so on. So I think you partly covered it. But also now I'm interested in the moral aspect of it, because it seems like it was acceptable because to some degree there was no literally, so it was just meant playing around. So then my question is, does penetration at some stage then change that moral stance around fertility?
So, okay, maybe I'll say the one thing, and I've done interviews myself on this topic a bit, and I've seen others. Yeah, the men at the mines, was it a space of freedom? I think to some extent it was, and I've heard men say this exactly, thinking nostalgically. These people who were interviewed in the 1980s, and in my case, some of the 90s, say, yeah. Back in the day, we did that at the mines. No one nagged us. These boys did what they were told, just like traditional wives were supposed to. But now women, they're uppity, right? Some of them have been educated, some of them have been to town, and they don't do what I tell them. And meanwhile, I've been away for years, and they've gotten used to plowing and doing things by themselves. And I come back, and she doesn't do what I ask. But on the mines, yeah, you could have these sexual relations. And everyone knew what the rules were. And the boys, by the way, would grow up, and then when they had meetings, they'd get out of the relationship and get their own wife. And so it was a kind of a conservative setting that people knew what the rules were. But in the real world, the rules were changing very fast because women were not accepting that traditional rule so much. Now, in terms of penetration, is your question about the actual sex acts change and so?
Yes, yeah, also what do you do? Does the outcome be really changing? Who starts the issue? If it's a culture of non-penetration, then when does it then become a sex?
That's a good question. It's no one has answered that question yet. But I have seen, again from the 80s, evidence that on the minds, and again, these people do not consider themselves gay or before or anything like that. But on the minds that penetrative sex was happening, was commonplace in the 1980s. When that started, when that changed, I have no idea. And how you would get that information from people is a good question. I don't know. And why it would change. I just don't know that. But the emergence of a kind of self-consciously gay identity that sees that as a kind of sexuality they really want and need, that doesn't really come until the 80s, per se. But tracing the actual behaviors back in time is really tough research question.
And then Prof, I'd also like to believe that maybe one of the challenges is none of these things are sort of temporarily fixed. I mean, it's dynamic. I don't know if you agree with me. I'm assuming that from the human sort of nature, people do different things within the same time period. So would you be able to definitely say between 19XX and 19XX, this was the kind of status that people were having, and there was no penetrative sex at all, which I believe is the challenge of the archive, because I assume does it then point out the nuances of Kuzai's behavior is not necessarily reflective of those who the court has been able to report as having done something. So I think, yeah, sort of like the temporal dynamics and the nuances of human behavior also become some sort of a silent archive, because you have certain curiosities that it can answer. What do you think of that? And we also have a similar question there, which also made me think about connecting with that answer. Thank you for the excellent lecture. My research is centered on archival materials from South Africa prior to the democratic dispensation, and this is Samantha. During your presentation, you mentioned the unpredictable nature of archives. I'd be interested to know more about your experience and advice on relying on archives for graduate studies and going back to the ally versus methodological tool debate you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I guess it does depend on the question you're asking. So if you're asking the question, which I wasn't very interested in, when did penetrative sex start versus disex? But I've heard it before, and then I did keep it open-minded. There's another archive that might answer that. Medical records do, to a certain extent. So I have seen so that's a whole other project. And off the top of my head, I can recall an investigation, and I believe it was the 1960s, where they checked for sexually transmitted anal infections. And among African men, it was very, very, very low at that time in 1960s. Among European men, it was what you would expect from the size of the demography, basically. So that's just, there was a difference in sexual practice in the two communities, but it changed over time. If you look at the records over time, that frequency of sexually transmitted infection increases in population in. So yeah, because what the question you're asking is and the unpredictability of the archives, it could easily happen that where you think the answer might be, it's not there. And then you just give up and you have to find it somewhere else. And that's happened to me in a number of occasions. And I'll tell, I think it's a kind of funny story. When I started this in Zimbabwe, there was a very conservative, old school type of historian. He didn't approve of this research. He thought I was wasting my time. And I didn't know where to start because it's taboo. You can't just go ask people about this. So I didn't know where to go. And I asked him, where should I look? I'm trying to answer the question, did Zimbabweans have same-sex relations before 1890, which is when the colonials arrived? And he said, okay, well, that's a tough question to ask because Zimbabweans before 1890 didn't write this stuff down because they barely even would talk about it. However, he gave me a reference. Go look here. This is a colonial official who was there in a rural area and he was dealing with the chiefs. And he was recording the traditional authority and the judgments there. Ah, okay. This way will help me to get to the traditional justice system in 1890. So I went to that document. It's written in very tiny little handwriting. I can hardly read it. And I was going to about 3 days. There's nothing. And I went back to my colleague and said, there's nothing there. And he said, exactly. So he wanted me to stop the research. to torture me with this project. So anyway, then I gave up. I'm not going to find anything by that method. So let me look somewhere else. Understanding how problematic the court system is. Obviously, if you have a loving relationship, you're not going to go to court. Right? Most of those cases in the Zimbabwe case, they came because there was a disagreement between the wife and the husband. The wife was unhappy that the husband was not treating her in the right way, that moral code specified. So the wife would lodge a claim, just like a female wife in a traditional setting would go to her parents or go to a chief and say, my husband is neglecting me. So those kind of cases came up. But most of the cases were, where they were caught in an active sexual violence. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. But you need to be, I guess, to answer your question, that since the archives are unpredictable, you have to be flexible as a researcher and adapt to what is coming your way. So that probably applies to everyone, not just historians.
Thank you, Prof. And I'm glad you are giving us with a lot of, you are showing us a lot of the gaps here. So at least for those who are looking for research topics, I think Prof has dropped around 3 or 4 of them. I see there's a new message. Let's just see if it's a question. Oh, it's a thank you. Colleagues, if there are no burning or final questions or remarks or any comments, I'm going to check if Prof, you want to maybe wrap up the presentation. Is there a way of sort of checking out based on the conversation we had, which has been very, very, very informative.
Yeah, well, I don't have to go on. I just want to say the point of the last 2 books there with Ian, and it's not a book, it's a catalog. The whole point of that, and I think what I've been saying today too, is that history is really important for democracy in every country in the world, including this one. And that if we aren't active and we are not encouraging high school students and even younger to take it as a serious endeavor, as a democratic obligation, then we're going to end up in a situation like we have in my neighboring country. And it's a danger everywhere in the world. We see authoritarian governments, Christian right, not pick on Christian right, Islamist movements are all vying for our attention. And if we go down those roads, we're going to be in big trouble when it comes to some of the other things on the environmental agenda and social justice again. So yeah, everyone, that's the history work. And meanwhile, it's fun.
Ask about the environmental And to do that.
Yes,
Okay, that's great. Actually, this came up at the history workshop just the other day. We had this came up almost the same thing. What's the role of public intellectuals? So I can link it back to your public historian and public intellectuals. We're at a moment when, as a society, we have to reimagine how we're going to move forward. We can't keep doing the same thing. Everyone agrees with that. Even business papers will say we're on a path of doom and destruction if we keep doing the same thing. So other people are proposing, let's go do this with artificial intelligence and let's send more money to Silicon Valley and California. Some people are proposing crazy ideas. But yeah, go to Mars. Space tourism, let's do all this stuff. Why not? But I think the role of public historians is to say, let's go back and see what worked to some extent in the past. Not to go back to an idealized, romantic Stone Age. Not at all. But there were obviously things in the past that worked to maintain community, solidarity, harmony in ways that maybe we can learn from that. So the historian is saying, yes, let's see if there are things there that can help in the reimagining of ways forward. So in terms of the environment, it's obvious that traditional cultures were leveling, right? They didn't reward people for greed. That was witchcraft, right? Why would we do that? You had to share. If you had bounty and you had more cattle than your neighbor, then you come together in collective work. That was positive social value. Now people make fun of you. In Canada, they had that same kind of in First Nation people on the West Coast. If you were so fortunate to acquire wealth, that was a big shame, to be publicly wealthy. So you would have a huge celebration, invite everyone and deplete your entire wealth in sharing. So the Canadian state came in and banned that. It was illegal until just a few years ago, because it said, if you don't have personal accumulation, how are you ever going to develop? And now people are going back to that and saying, we're not going to develop in a capitalist way, but we want to have this cultural sharing and keeping everyone at the kind of same level of wealth. And it's a public celebration of generosity that's just been legalized in the last 10 years after decades and decades of oppression by the Canadian state. So historians have been part of that, and anthropologists as well. Separate, obviously, the trick is to separate the oppressive aspects of the traditional culture on gender and whatever else was there. So you don't want to bring that forward. How can you weed some of that out? Environment, things like people are thinking about ecotourism and this and that, and what does that do about killing and eating animals, and all that kind of thing. Can that be done in a way that is culturally sensitive and respectful to the animals? It's a big debate. That the dogmatic response from the vegan dogmatists would say, no, it can't be done. But that's another kind of colonialism. It's coming from one position. Indigenous people saying, no, this was always part of our culture. And we did it in a way that respected the animals. And I don't know, how can it be done? It's a good question.
Thank you so much. Very, very interesting examples there. And Prof, on this note, I'd really love to thank you so much for taking the time to come and this distinguished lecture and to outpour what I believe is also a personal archive that you've really brought to the space. So on behalf of the entire Wits team, I'd like to thank you and thank you all for coming through. And colleagues, our conversation doesn't end here. We have snacks, refreshments, so we can continue to engage and warm up the space. So just the last round of applause for Prof.
Thank you so much.